And at morning call, you can use the bathroom, get some beignets, get some etouffee. It's delicious, by the way. Anything to drink there except for booze. But you can also catch a Uber, Lyft, or the streetcar back if you want to take the streetcar back to the French Quarter. Because the streetcar ends right where morning call and kind of turns around and then comes back this way.
Wow, that's nice.
Any questions before we begin?
No.
Ask as many questions. Take as many pictures as you like.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, follow me. Well, cool. Welcome to La Nouvelle Orleans, New Orleans. Where are y'all from?
North Carolina.
Oh yeah, I've been in the mud there. So New Orleans actually gets its start around 1699, but the French don't start building the city until 1718. And so we had a cemetery located right on the banks of the Mississippi River that they put there in their first burial in 1699. But the reason it's not there today, because it would be right in front of where the St. Louis Cathedral Church is. Y'all seen the church downtown, the big church?
Yeah.
It would have been right there in front of the church by the river. Bienville, one of the founders, writes, Le Mont Flottant de la Rue in 1718. The dead came floating down the street. Massive storm comes in, washes out the embankment, and pushes the bodies right into the center of the city. And it terrified the French because they had just started building here, and they realized that this could very well be a sign from the Almighty that you've chosen the wrong ground to build. Well, that begins our superstition. The problem was, before we could even tell that story to generations ahead of us, we have our second problem. And our second problem was our second cemetery. Our second cemetery we located in the middle of the French Quarter in 1718. And since it was much lower ground than our first one, we didn't realize that our water table would affect anything in the ground. And so when it flooded, our water table would rise, and now we would start to see these boxes pop back out of the ground surface. That terrified the French even further because they never saw it with the first cemetery, and now they're seeing it again. Clearly think that something is amiss here in New Orleans. It could even be something as close as God cursing the ground that they built upon. Now, before we move on any further, I do want to talk about this cemetery here. This is called the Gates of Prayer. It is a Jewish cemetery, and a couple things you'll notice about Jewish tradition is, one, all the headstones read one direction. They're going to read toward the city of Jerusalem. And the only time that you'll see anything that inside a cemetery that's not doing that is if it's some sort of memorial. Now, the other thing you'll notice is as you scan across this, you'll see these concrete columns coming out of the headstones. There's a few of them here. There's one real close there, a couple back here, another one right there, another one back there. These columns represent a tree that's been cut down. And it means that the tree has been cut too short, indicating who's buried there is a teenager. It means that their life had been cut too short. But you'll also see that they are buried in the ground, which is a contradictory to what most people believe, is that we bury above ground here because of our water table problem, and that's not true at all, not even close. I'm going to get into more of that in just a moment, but these are called coping graves. There are 4 walls that go straight down into the ground, 6 feet down, and they have a base down at the bottom. And the reason why this is important, because in the Jewish culture, the body has to be buried back to soil, naturally. It's in an all-wood coffin. There's no brackets or hinges. Everything is natural, and it needs to decay naturally, because they also believe on the first anniversary date of their death that's when the spirit is released and goes upstairs. Now, if you'll follow me this way, there's one more thing I want to show you down here. The Jewish also believe on that anniversary date, which is referred to in Hebrew as Avalut. And when the spirit's released and goes upstairs, they believe their loved ones are looking down upon you. And so how do you remind them you've not forgotten them? Well, as you get toward the later part of this cemetery here, you're going to start seeing these little rocks appear on top of the headstone. These rocks serve as a beacon that goes all the way up, tells their loved one, I have not forgotten. And there's a couple of rules to it. They have to choose the rock from outside the cemetery. And then once the rock is placed on the headstone, that's it. If it gets knocked off for any reason, like these rocks would have over here, if it gets knocked off for any reason, you can never use them again. Now we got this thing here in Louisiana that North Carolina gets from time to time called hurricanes.
Yeah.
And the wind will come in and blow these rocks right off, and the families just have to start over. Yep. Now, we're going to get into our third major problem that changed everything about our burials as we make our way down here. But before we leave here, I want you to kind of see what you're looking at. There are 3 more cemeteries going that way. You have the Gates of Prayer, you have the St. Patrick Cemetery, which we're going into next, and then those trees back there, that is part of Charity Hospital Cemetery. And then you look across the street, you got 2 more cemeteries. There's the Hope Mausoleum, the big wall there, and then behind that wall is another cemetery called St. John. I'll kind of show you a different angle of that. But there's 18 cemeteries right here in this one little circle. And it was all stemmed from our very next problem. So let's find out what that is. So, we're dealing with our bodies rising up out of the ground as it floods. New Orleans, with the exception of a couple of locations, we are below sea level here. And one of the reasons why they chose the French Quarter is because that area seemed to flood less, and it's only 6 feet above sea level. Well, in 1788, on March 21st, we have our first major fire. Burns the entire city to the ground, give or take. I think there was about 200 buildings out of 1,100 that survived. And the government says we're never going to let that happen again. And the reason why is it happened on Good Friday. Because it was a Catholic holiday, the priest couldn't ring the bells, and no one was alarmed that the city was on fire. So what the government did, and have y'all been in the French Quarter already?
Yeah.
If you notice that when you look up at the architecture, the roofs face toward the street. And the reason why is that as we rebuilt the city going into the late 17, early 1800s, we wanted to focus the rain right there on the edges of the street, because now we would put these huge troughs that would collect that rainwater, and every structure would have it, and then we would use that water for the next fire in case we didn't get the alarm. And the challenge was that since they couldn't get the alarm, we would line people up with buckets, and that just didn't work. So now we would just use the water in front of every structure for the very next fire. Well, sounds like a great idea for firefighting. Horrible idea for disease. And that following year in 1788, we get a brand new one. Now, I wanted to point out St. John Cemetery. You can see the above ground tombs over here. That was established in 1867. The wall you see was built in 1931. Another Jewish cemetery here. This is called the Dispersed Judah in 1846. And behind you is St. Patrick Cemetery number 1. That's the one we're going into next. But I do want to point this out. This cemetery, when we walk in, you'll see how far it goes back. It goes all the way to that radio tower.
Wow.
And it's huge. And this was a result of yellow fever. And you're about to walk in one of the last pieces of evidence of how chaotic yellow fever was, specifically to the Irish. Now, as we walk in here, we're going to cross right here, folks. Watch your step. So 1788, we get our first exposure to this disease called yellow fever. And for whatever reason, we learned just a couple things about it. One, it's a reoccurring disease that shows up 90 years after we get here, which made it even more bizarre. But it also realized that it only seems to come in the hottest months of our summer. And I lived 6 years in North Carolina at Fort Bragg, and North Carolina has its heat, but it also has its cold. You are within a few weeks of winter here, and it's 76 degrees right now. It's going to reach 80 degrees tomorrow. Welcome to New Orleans. We're hot year round here mostly. And so when the Irish start coming in here after, let me back up a little bit, I'm sorry. When yellow fever hits us in 1788, 1789, we realize the disease is reoccurring. This is when we go to this type of tomb. We shut down the cemetery in the middle of the French Quarter, open up St. Louis Cemetery #1, and we go to the oven type tombs. Now, the reason that we went to these is because they are just exactly that, an oven. We thought we were getting the disease from our dead, and so because of that, we wanted to use a technique that the Romans used to deal with the plague, that we would 1,000 years later now use to deal with yellow fever, and we would build these above ground tombs. Now, there is a reason why you don't see a lot in this cemetery. And we're going to get to that because it had everything to do with how many people of Irish descent were coming here. Now, so, 1789, we open up St. Louis #1, we go to the above ground tombs, and everything was working fine for the first year. Now, the way these tombs are built, and these are some more modern tombs, but you're going to get to see some old ones as we make our way into Cypress Grove. The way these things were built is they first dig a hole into the ground about 3 feet. And the hole is called a caveau. It's a French word for cave. They'll brick and mortar that hole up and then put a foundation over the top of it. They leave a gap in the back of that foundation for cycling bodies.
1892.
Then the top part of this had one purpose. You would stick the body inside of here. It absorbed the radiant heat of the sun. We know now these get up to 350 degrees and they bake the body down.
Wow.
And that was the purpose, because we were Catholic. You couldn't decimate the dead, right? So we thought the disease was coming from our dead, which was crazy. And since we couldn't chop the body up or burn the body up, we thought for sure that the only way we could do this naturally and appease the Almighty is allow the body to decay naturally, but expedite it. And that's what these did. They just baked the body down. Now, I'm going to walk you through more about how we process the bodies, because essentially what you have here is 2 components. You have the oven and you have the storage below ground.
So do they have coffin too?
So you could have used a coffin. And I say that cautiously because when you find out how much we died in yellow fever, finding a coffin in the 1800s was like you finding toilet paper last year. Like, it was hard to do. Right. Now, let's talk about why the Irish did not want to go to the above ground tombs. And it was simple. They came over here in masses. So before 1803, and in the entire period, we were originally under the French, then later the Spanish, then back to the French for 45 days,
97.
and then under the American control in 1803. So when the Irish start coming here, because before 1803, the only way you could come here is you had to be Catholic. And if you weren't Catholic, you had to convert to Catholicism. If you didn't want to convert to Catholicism, you could lie about it. The Germans lied about it. Or you had to leave. Those were kind of your options.
So what kind of stones they're using? It's like a marble?
So you see a little bit of everything. You see marble, granite, concrete, brick. You'll see a whole variety of it. Now, the Irish start coming down here in the summers. And ladies, if you look just a couple of rows back over there, you can see a mound of dirt appearing up in front of the backside of that headstone. And we're on the backside of it. You can see that we still bury here today. You'll see a couple of recent graves here. And they still, and out of the 18 cemeteries here, only one no longer buries. The other 17 still do today. So the Irish come here in big droves, and they start coming here in the summertime. Now, I want to show you this because you only get a really weird angle. And, well, we'll walk over and see if we can see it. And so when the Irish come here, they're arriving here in the middle of our yellow fever outbreaks, and they are dying by the thousands. A great way to look at that is that out of every 10 people, out of a group of 10 people that would have died of yellow fever, 6 to 9 of those 10 would have been Catholics based off that demographic. And out of that 6 to 9 Catholics, 4 to 7 would have been Irish Catholics. And so when the Irish separate from the St. Louis Cathedral Church, they create their own church called St. Patrick's. And they're told they can't bury in the St. Louis cemeteries anymore. So they said, fine, be that way. We'll buy our own cemetery. And they do, this whole piece of land. The problem was they were told they're going to have to follow the 366 law. And that was a whole nother problem. So when we go to the above ground tombs in 1789, 1790, we realized they weren't working. And so what happens next is the government says, we're just not leaving the bodies in here long enough. We want them to bake just a little bit longer. And so they institute a law called 366. And we're gonna kind of zigzag through here. I want to show you something in this next field over here. I got some shovels for y'all too as well. I want to show you this next cemetery over here. We're going to be actually going in the front side of this. We just got to work our way around it. But this is really the only one angle that you can see this because it's hidden on both sides. So this grassy green field here, we're going to be walking out of the cemetery, going on the back side of it, and then going into the cemetery you see over there. This is Charity Hospital Cemetery. Has 150,000 people buried here. It's a mass grave style cemetery from 1848 to 1952. But I wanted you to see this because this is the closest you can get to it. And frankly, when I have bigger groups, I don't take them through this. We kind of just go through it and we try to see it from back there. Since you're such a smaller group. See the cross right there? So in 1952, they shut down that cemetery there. No more burials. Notice how the ground is higher than what we're standing on? Well, they put the Katrina Memorial on the other side of those trees over there. You're going to see that today. I'll take you inside of that one. But when they started building the Katrina Memorial, they realized that the graves were too close to the ground surface. And this was a mass grave site. So when they brought bodies here, they buried them on top of each other because they were dying in such astronomical numbers. And then, so when they built the Katrina Memorial, they came back, they removed a bunch of remains to put in the Katrina Memorial. I'm gonna show you down there where they placed the remains at. But then they came back in and put about 2 feet of dirt over the entire cemetery to give it some space between where the remains were buried at. The Kiwanis Club comes here and puts this here in 1954 because when they shut it down in 1952 and they did a news article and everybody was shocked. You buried how many people here? And 150,000 and not a single headstone. And the way that they originally planted these trees, right where that cross is they built a cross as well with the trees itself. You can see the cross trees going across here. Some of the trees have fallen over time. But the Kiwanis Club just thought it was just awful that there was not a single marker. So you were looking at the only headstone. The 150,000 people that were buried here under true conditions died in charity, and they were unclaimed by the flood. All right, let's make our way back out to the street. Kind of watch our step here. I'm sorry I didn't bring the shovel. So we do have a bus tour. However, we don't go into any cemeteries because they're closed up. We are working aggressively on getting some of the cemeteries to let us come in at night. But it is fighting a hopeless battle up hills both ways. Because some cemeteries will let you in if the price is right. The problem is, what they want is more than we're making on the tours. So how's that beneficial, right? Now, but yours truly is working. I'm negotiating with 3 cemeteries right now. So we got at least 3, got the gears over. The Irish. The Irish realized that that out of that 6 to 9 Catholics that died, 4 to 7 Irish are in that 6 to 9. So out of summers where we were dying 1,000 people a week, we're burying here 400 to 700 a week in this one single cemetery. And the Irish realize that they can't follow the 366 law. Now, what that meant was in 1790 when they extended the 366 law, you put a body in one of these tombs, you had to leave it in there for 1 year at one day. You could open it, no matter how many more people die. And so the big question is, what do you do if somebody else dies in your family? Where do you put them at? You can't put them in your family tomb just yet. And so what the Spanish came up with was called the plumbaria. It was a shelf, had about a dozen tombs in it, and you would rent one of those. And so you put a loved one in your family tomb, and someone dies 6 months later, you would rent this little side tomb. We had later would start calling wall vaults or rental vaults. You'll see those examples in Cypress Grove when we walk in there. And then the year and a day would start ticking on both groups, on your above ground tomb and that rental tomb. The Irish says we can't do that. We died too much. If we were going to build a wall, it would go miles past. I believe we got a truck here, folks.
Mahal kaya ng mga bato na to.
Ladies, can y'all give me 1 minute? I just want to talk to these guys. I'll be right back.
Okay. We'll hide over here. Magkano binayad mo? Magkano binayad mo?
Y'all enjoy.
Ah, ito yung may mga cremate, na cremate. Ayan o.
Picture, Carl?
Mamaya.
All right, let's make our way. So the Irish says, if the Jewish can get their special permission to go to below ground burials, you saw their graves in the gates of prayer. Because what happens is in 1803 we become a U.S. territory, but we had already approved the only way you could be buried was in the above ground tombs. Well, when the Jewish come in, they said, folks, we need to go back to below ground. By the way, the food is delicious. However, it doesn't change anything that we got to do at our burials. And so the government makes two provisions to go to below ground burials, one for the Jewish and one for the poor.
Oh.
The Irish come in about 25 years later and says, hey, we're dying too much. We can't build this massive wall.
That's
but
new.
nobody's listening to it.
That's 2021.
Oh yeah, they still bury here today, and he died really early. I'm kidding. So what happens is the Irish go all the way to the Vatican, get special permission from the cardinal, because the bishop had denied their request to go to below ground burials. And when that happens, the cardinal says, I'm not sure what you're asking me for, because we're burying Catholics all around the world below ground. No one knew what was happening here in little old New Orleans because it wasn't really happening anywhere in the state. And so the cardinal says, fine, you want below ground burials? Here you go. Don't come back and don't drink so much, you Irish Catholic priest. and they come back here with permission to go to these, what's called open graves. Now, why the steps? Because you weren't allowed to have funerals during the yellow fever outbreaks. So how did you get your body here? It was real simple. You wrap them up in a shroud, open up the back door to your house in the French Quarter, you put a note on the clothing, and you put them right on the sidewalks.
And they're going to pick it up.
And they would come pick them up in buggies and bring them down here. And this is why there were originally 15 cemeteries in the 1800s. We've added 3 more in the 1900s. But they would come back here and start dropping them off at the different cemeteries for efficiency. But it was also about mitigating contact with the dead, because we thought that that's where we were getting the disease from. So when we touched our dead, we were trying just to do that as least as possible. And so this was the solution. And so when you came down here during the daytime, because they would bury at night, you would kneel and pray right here. And Catholics kneel and pray a lot. I know.
Yeah.
And so the reason we think, we don't have any evidence on this, but the reason we think that the term coping grave comes from here is because people would see the Catholics kneeling and coping with the death of their loved one, where in the other cemeteries we really weren't doing that, right? And so as the Protestants and Methodists and the Lutherans come in, they were like, oh, the Catholics do it. and that's where we think the term coping grave comes from. Now, there is no magical number. You've seen some of these graves have a dozen names on it, and we can keep burying in there indefinitely. There is a stipulation to the slab that's been laid over the top of that, and that means that this grave is done. So the last person that died here in 1928, no one else will be buried here.
Oh.
Now, it comes from relationships. As are we friends or family or?
Family.
Okay. So let's say you are in charge of the family, and then you pass away, God forbid, and someone else in your family now inherits this because it is a piece of property. But they're also in a relationship with somebody else, and the conversation is, where are we going to be buried at? Well, they'll say, well, I'm not going in your family's grave, and I'm not going in your family's grave. So they'll buy their own, and then when the last family member dies, they will seal the top of it. You don't have to.
Yeah.
It's not a requirement.
It's the same thing in the Philippines.
Yeah. Okay. And so you see a lot of division, and the primary reason that you don't see 30, 40 names on here is because families splinter off.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about how we work these tombs over here, and then you get to see the inside of one, if they have not capped it off yet. So inside of here, remember I talked about there's a hole down at the bottom called the caveau? So you slide the body inside there, and then the body bakes.
Oh.
And then after the year and a day, they would open up the closure tablet. Behind that would be a row of bricks. You're going to see a lot more older above ground tombs in here. These above ground tombs on here aren't older, because the only burying that the Irish would do was these. It wasn't until after about 1860 that we learned where yellow fever comes from. And it's not our dead, boy, will we know. That they start going to the above ground tombs. However, they'd slide the body in there. They use this long stick called a dead stick. They would rake the ash out, put it into a bag, and then seal that bag up. And at that point, they'd stick the bag back inside the tomb there with that long stick, and they'd slide that bag all the way to the back. It reached this part of the backside of the tomb called the shaft, if you could think of like an elevator shaft, and the bag would fall down to that into the hole below them. Now, the way we built these in 1789 and how we built them today really aren't much different. They're a lot more elegant, a lot more stonework, because we get access to that more now. But there is no foundation over the bottom anymore. The caveau is still dug, and the access to the caveau is now in the front. Now, with that said, let's talk about how much these cost. So the standard coping grave of just the white concrete, not the stone, that's going to start you at about $11,000, and that can go up. The white above ground tomb, like you see throughout here, the concrete, that will start you at about $36,000, and that can go up. And then if you start getting into this, you're going to exceed $50,000. And when you get into the marble ones like those are well over $100,000.
There's still difference from poor people that died and rich.
You can tell.
You can tell.
That's correct.
Okay.
And here, so you don't see a lot of elegant tombs in this one. When we get in Cypress Grove, you're going to see some amazing tombs in there, because Cypress Grove is a city cemetery. The Catholics limit on what you could build. You could not build a monstrosity of a tomb here like you could over there, because it was a city cemetery, and we're going in that one next. And even $100,000 really isn't that expensive in regards to some of these tombs. There's a cemetery right on the other side of the interstate. You can't see it from here. It's called Metairie Cemetery. It has 1,100 tombs in it. 5 dozen of those 1,100 tombs are over $1 million. And there's one of them, the biggest one is $5.9 million. It's just this 3-story gigantic church. But if you thought about coming to New Orleans and thought about how nice New Orleans is and just the culture, and you're like, this would be cool to be buried in a cemetery like this, and I've destroyed your dreams, I'm sorry about that. What I can do for you, and this is a limited time price only, I can get you that garbage can for $9.95 right there.